Grand Orient Masonry, Unmasked, Part 2. Chapter 1. Good versus Evil. Speaking of the operative classes, Leo XIII says in his celebrated Encyclical Humanum Genus, "Those who sustain themselves by the labor of their own hands, besides being by their very condition most worthy above all others of charity and consolation, are also especially exposed to the allurements of men whose ways lie in fraud and deceit. Therefore they ought to be helped with the greatest possible kindness, and invited to join societies that are good, lest they be drawn away to others that are evil. In this, as in all matters of importance, to be forewarned is to be forearmed, and it is specially necessary to be forewarned when we have to contend with an adversary who uses secrecy, fraud, and deceit. We shall see, then, that all organizations of atheism appear as first, as does their author, Satan, clothed in the raiment of angels of light, with their malignity, their infidelity, and their ultimate design always most carefully hidden. They come amongst all the faithful, but more especially amongst the young men, to seduce and to ruin them, never showing, but when forced to do so, the cloven foot, and employing a million means to seem to be what they are not. It is, therefore, first of all, necessary to unmask them, and this is precisely what the Supreme Pontiff asks the pastors of the universal fold to do as the best means of destroying their influence. But, he says in the encyclical already quoted, as it befits our pastoral office that we ourselves should point out some suitable way of proceeding, we wish it to be your rule, first of all, to tear away the mask from Freemasonry, and to let it be seen as it really is, by the instructions and pastoral letters to instruct the people as to the artifices used by societies of this kind in seducing men and enticing them into their ranks, and as to the depravity of their opinions and the wickedness of their acts." In this extract, the Holy Father makes special mention of Freemasonry, but, remember, not of Freemasonry only. He speaks of other secret societies. These other secret societies are identical with Freemasonry, no matter by what name they may be called, and they are frequently the most depraved forms of Freemasonry. And though what is known in Great Britain as Freemasonry may not be so malignant as its kind is on the continent, though it may have little or no hold at all upon the mass of Catholics in English-speaking countries, still we shall see that like every secret society in existence, it is a danger for the nation and for individuals, and has hidden within it the same atheism and hostility to Christianity which the worst continental Freemasonry possesses. These it develops to the uninitiated in the higher degrees, and makes manifest to all the world in time. The truth is that every secret society is framed and adapted to make men the enemies of God and of his church, and to subvert faith. And there is not one, no matter on what pretext it may be founded, which does not fall under the management of a supreme directory governing all the secret societies on earth. The one aim of this directory is to uproot Christianity and the Christian social order, as well as the church, from the world. In fact, to eradicate the name of Jesus and the very Christian idea from the minds and hearts of men. This it is determined to do so by every means, but especially by fraud and force. That is, by first using the wiles and deceit until the atheistic conspiracy grows strong enough for measures as violent and remorseless in all countries as it is exercised in one country during the first French Revolution. I believe this secret atheistic organization to be nothing less than the evil which we have been long warned against by our blessed Lord himself, as the supreme conflict between the Church and Satan's followers. It is the commencement of the contest which must take place between Christ and Antichrist, and nothing, therefore, can be more necessary than that the elect of God should be warned of its nature and its aims. First, we shall glance at the rise and the nature of atheism itself, and its rapid advance amongst those sections of Christians most liable from position and surroundings to be led astray by it, and then at the use it has made of Freemasonry for its propagandism and for its contemplated destruction of Christianity. We shall see its depravity perfected by what is called Illuminism, and we shall see that however checked it may have been by the reaction consequent among the excesses of the first revolution, it has not only outlived that reaction, but it has grown wiser for doing an evil more extended and more complete. We shall see how its chiefs have succeeded in mastering and directing every kind of secret association, whether springing from itself or coming into existence by the force of its example only, and have used and are using them to its advantage. We shall see the sleepless vigilance which this organized atheism exercises, and thus come to know that our only resource, is to fly its emissaries and draw nearer in affection and in effect to the teachings of the Church and her supreme visible head on earth, who can never deceive us, and whom the host of Satan can never deceive. We shall see that the voice of the Vicar of Christ has been raised against secret associations from the beginning to this hour, and that the directions from which we receive from that infallible voice can alone save us from the wiles and deceits of a conspiracy so formidable, so active, so malignant, and so dangerous. Chapter 2. The Rise of Atheism in Europe. In order, then, to comprehend thoroughly the nature of the conspiracy, it will be necessary to go back to the opening of the last century and contemplate the rise and advance of the atheism and anti-Christianity which it now spreads rapidly through the earth. As that century opened, it disclosed a world suffering from a multitude of evils. The so-called Reformation, which arose and continued to progress during the two preceding centuries, had well nigh run its course. The principle of private judgment, introduced in apparent zeal for the pure worship and doctrine of Christ, had ended in leaving no part of the teaching of Christ unchallenged. It had rendered his divinity disbelieved in, and his very existence doubted, by many who yet called themselves his followers. Socinus and his nephew had succeeded in binding the various groups of Polish and German Protestants in a league where nothing was required but the undying hatred and opposition to the Catholic Church. Baal threw doubt upon everything, and Spinoza destroyed the little respect left for the deity in the system of Socinus by introducing pantheism to the world. In effect, both the deists and the pantheists of that period were atheists. Whether they held that everything was God, or that God was not such a God as Christians hold him to be, they did away with belief in the true God, and raised up an impossible being of their own imagination in his stead. In life, in conduct, and in adoration of God, they were all practical atheists, and soon manifested that hatred for the truth which the atheist is sure to possess. Their theories made headway early in the century throughout Central Europe and in England. Bolingbroke, Shaftesbury, and the elite among the statesmen and literary aristocracy of the reign of Queen Anne were infidels. Tyndall, Colin, Woolston, Toland, and Chubbs were as advanced as Tom Paine was, later on, in the way of atheism. But however much England and Germany had advanced their Protestantism to what was called free thinking, both were soon destined to be eclipsed in that sad progress by Catholic and monarchical France. France owes this evil preeminence to one individual, who, though largely assisted in his road to ruin by Baal, and subsequently by association with English infidels, had yet enough of innate wickedness in himself to outstrip them all. That individual was Voltaire. Chapter 3. Voltaire. The career of this abandoned, unhappy, but most extraordinary man is the subject of this chapter. It was in his day and by his means that atheism became perfected, generalized, and organized for the destruction of Christianity, Christian civilization, and all religion. He was the first, and remains still, the greatest of its apostles. There is not one of its dark principles which he did not teach and advocate. And from his writings, and by their means, the intellectual and every other form of war against the Catholic Church and the cause of Christ are carried on to this day, and will be to the end. His real name was Francis Mary Arouet, but for some reason which he has never clearly explained, he chose to call himself Voltaire. He was the son of good parents, and by position and education should have been an excellent Catholic. He was trained by the very Jesuits whom he afterwards so hated and persecuted. He was destined for the profession of the law, and made good progress in literary studies. But the corruption of the age in which he lived soon seized upon him, overmastered him, and bore him along in a current which in his case did not end in vice only, but in vice which sought its own justification in infidelity. From the beginning, the fool said in his heart, "There is no God." And in the days of Voltaire the number of these fools was indeed infinite. Never before was vice so rampant in countries calling themselves Christian. If the gospel was preached at all in that age, it was certainly to the poor. For the rich, as a rule, to which there were, thank God, many exceptions, seemed so sunk in vice as not to believe in a particle of it. The courts of Europe were, in general, corrupt to the core, and the court of the most Christian king was perhaps the most abandoned, in a wide sense, of them all. The court of Catherine of Russia, a scene of unblushing lewdness. The court of Frederick of Prussia was so corrupt that it cannot be described without doing violence to decency, and even to humanity. The Regent Orleans and Louis XV had carried license to such an extent as to render the court of Versailles a veritable pandemonium. The vices of royalty infected the nobles and all others who were so unfortunate as to be permitted to frequent courts. Vice, in fact, was the fashion, and the number of all classes, not excepting the poorest, wallowed in it. As a consequence, the libertines of the period hated the Church, which alone, amidst the universal depravity, raised her voice for purity. They took up warmly, therefore, the movements which, within or without her pale, were likely to do her damage. With a sure instinct they sided in France with Gallicanism and Jansenism, and they welcomed the new infidelity which came over from England and Germany with unconcealed gladness. Voltaire appeared in French society at this most opportune moment for the advancement of his views. Witty, sarcastic, gay, vivacious, he soon made his way amongst the voluptuaries who then filled Paris. His conduct and habit of ridiculing religion and royalty brought him, however, into disfavor with the government, and at the age of 27 we find him in the Bastille. Liberated from this prison in 1727, but only on condition of exile, he crossed over to England, where he finally adopted those infidel and anti-Christian principles which made him, for the half-century through which he afterwards lived, what Cretineau Joly very justly calls the most perfect incarnation of Satan that the world ever saw. The Society of Freemasons was just then perfected in London, and Voltaire, at the instance of his infidel associates, joined one of its lodges. And he left England, where he had been during the years 1726 to 1027 and 28, an adept in both infidelity and Freemasonry. He returned to the continent with bitterness rankling in his breast against monarchical government, which had imprisoned and exiled him, against the Bastille where he was immured, and, above all, against the Catholic Church and her divine founder. Christ and his Church condemned his excesses, and to the overthrow of both he devoted himself with an ardor and a malignity more characteristic, certainly, of a demon than of a man. A master of French prose, hardly ever equaled and never perhaps excelled, and a graceful and correct versifier, his writings against morality and religion grew into immense favor with the corrupt reading public of his day. He was a perfect adept in the use of ridicule, and he employed it with remorseless and blasphemous force against everything pure and sacred. He had as little respect for the honor or welfare of his country as he had for the sanctity of religion. His ruffian pen attacked the fair name of the Maid of Orleans with as little scruple as it cast shame upon the consecrated servants of Christ. For Christ he had but one feeling, eternal, contemptuous hatred. His watchword, the concluding lines of all his letters to his infidel confederates, for 50 years was "Écrasons nous infamie," let us crush the wretch, meaning Christ and his cause. Then he boasted indeed his delenda est Carthago, and he believed he could succeed. I am tired, said he, of hearing it said that 12 men suffice to establish Christianity, and I desire to show that it requires but one man to pull it down. A lieutenant of police once said to him that, notwithstanding all he wrote, he should never be able to destroy Christianity. That is exactly what we shall see, he replied. Voltaire was never wearying of using his horrible watchword. Upon the news of the suppression of the Jesuits reaching him, he exclaimed, "See, one head of the Hydra has fallen. I lift my eyes to heaven and cry, Crush the wretch!" We have from himself his reason for using these blasphemous words. I finish all my letters by saying, "Écrasons v'infâme, et rachis v'infâme." Let us crush the wretch, as Cato used one time to say, "Delenda est Carthago," Carthage must be destroyed. Even at a time when the miscreant protested the greatest respect for religion to the court of Rome, he wrote to Damiliaville, "We embrace the philosophers. We beseech them to inspire for the wretch of all horror, which they can. Let us fall upon the wretch ably. That which most concerns me is the propagation of the faith of truth, and making of the wretch vile, delenda est Carthago." Certainly his determination was strong to do so, and he left no stone unturned for that end. He was a man of amazing industry, and though his vanity caused him to quarrel with many of his confrères, he had in his lifetime a large school of disciples, which became still more numerous after his death. He sketched out for them the whole mode of procedure against the Church. His policy, as revealed by the correspondence of Frederick II, and others with him, was not to commence an immediate persecution, but first to suppress the Jesuits and all religious orders, and to secularize their goods, then to deprive the Pope of temporal authority, and the Church of property and state recognition. Primary and higher class education of a lay and infidel character was to be established, the principle of divorce affirmed, and respect for ecclesiastics lessened and destroyed. Lastly, when the whole body of the Church should be sufficiently weakened and the infidelity strong enough, the final blow was to be dealt by the sword of open, relentless persecution. A reign of terror was to spread over the whole earth, and to continue while a Christian should be found obstinate enough to adhere to Christianity. This, of course, was to be followed by a universal brotherhood without marriage, family, property, God, or law, in which all men would reach that level of social degradation aimed at by the disciples of Saint Simon, and carried into practice whenever possible, as attempted by the French Commune. In carrying out his infernal designs against religion and society, Voltaire had as little scruple in using lying and hypocrisy as Satan himself is accredited with. In his attacks upon religion, he falsified history and fact. He made a principle of lying, and taught the same vice to his followers. Writing to his disciple Theriot, he says, "Lying is a vice when it does evil. It is a great virtue when it does good. Therefore more virtuous than ever. Be therefore more virtuous than ever. It is necessary to lie like a devil, not timidly and for a time, but boldly and always." He was also, as the school he left behind has been ever since, a hypocrite. Infidel to the heart's core, he could, whenever it suited his purpose, both practice and even feign a zeal for religion. On the expectation of a pension from the king, he wrote to Monsieur Argental, a disciple of his, who reproached him with his hypocrisy and contradictions in conduct. "If I had 100,000 men, I know well what I would do. But as I have not got them, I will go to communion at Easter, and you may call me a hypocrite as long as you like." And Voltaire, on getting his pension, went to communion the year following. It is needless to say that he was in life, as well as in his writings, immoral as it was possible for a man to be. He lived without shame and even ostentatiously in open adultery. He laughed at every moral restraint. He preached libertinage and practiced it. He was the guest and the inmate of the court of Frederick in Prussia, where crime reached proportions impossible to speak of. And, lastly, coward, liar, hypocrite, and panderer to the basest passions of humanity, he was finally, like Satan, a murderer if he had the power to be so. Writing to Demilieville, he says, "The Christian religion is an infamous religion, an abominable hydra which must be destroyed by 100 invisible hands. It is necessary that the philosophers should course through streets to destroy it as missionaries course over the earth and sea to propagate it. They ought to dare all things, risk all things, even to be burned, in order to destroy it. Let us crush the wretch. Crush the wretch." His doctrine, thus expressed, found fatal effect in the French Revolution, and it will obtain effect whenever his disciples are strong enough in men and means to act. I have no doubt his teachings have led to all the revolutions of this century, and will lead to the final attack of atheism on the Church. It was his hatred confined to Catholicism only. Christians of every denomination were marked out for destruction by him, and our separated Christian brethren, who feel glad at seeing his followers triumph over the Church, might well ponder on these words of his. "Christians," he says, "of every form of profession are beings exceedingly injurious, fanatics, thieves, dupes, impostors, who lie together with their gospels, enemies of the human race." And of the system itself he writes, "The Christian religion is evidently false. The Christian religion is a sect which every good man ought to hold in horror. It cannot be approved of even by those to whom it gives power and honor. In fact, since his day, it has been a cardinal point of policy with his followers to take advantage of the unfortunate differences between the various sects of Christians around the world and the Church, in order to ruin both. For the destruction of every form of Christianity, as well as Catholicism, was the aim of Voltaire, and remains as certainly the aim of his disciples. They place, of course, the Church and the Vicar of Christ in the first line of attack, well knowing that if the great Catholic unity could be destroyed, the work of eradicating every kind of separated Christianity would be easy. In dealing, therefore, with such a foe as modern atheism, so powerfully organized, as we shall see it to be, Protestants as well as Catholics should guard against its wiles and deceits. They should, at least, regarding questions such as the religious education of rising generations, the attempted secularization of the Sabbath and state-established Christian institutions, and the recognition of religion by the state, all of which the atheism of the world now attempts to destroy, present an unbroken front of determined union. Nothing less, certainly, can save even the Protestantism, the national Christian character of Great Britain and her colonies, from impending ruin. Although Voltaire was as confirmed and malignant a hater of Christ and of Christianity as ever lived, still he showed from time to time that his own professed principles of infidelity were never really believed in by himself. In health and strength he cried out his blasphemous, "Crush the wretch." But when the moment came for his soul to appear before the judgment seat of the wretch, his faith was shown and his vaunted courage failed him. The miscreant always acted against his better knowledge. His life gives us many examples of this fact. I will relate one for you. When he broke a blood vessel on one occasion, he begged his assistants to hurry for the priest. He confessed, signed with his hand a profession of faith, asked pardon of God and the Church for his offenses, and ordered that his retraction should be printed in the public newspapers. But, recovering, he commenced his war upon God anew, and died refusing all spiritual aid, crying out in the fury of despair and agony, "I am abandoned by God and man." Dr. Fruchen, who witnessed the awful spectacle of his death, said to his friends, "Would that all who had been seduced by the writings of Voltaire had been witness of his death. It would be impossible to hold out in the face of such an awful spectacle." But that spectacle was forgotten, and consequently, before 10 years passed, the world saw the effects of his works. Speaking of the French Revolution, Condorcet, in his Life of Voltaire, says of him, "He did not see all that which he accomplished, but he did all that which we see. Enlightened observations prove to those who know how to reflect that the first author of that great revolution was without doubt Voltaire." It never was the intention of this man to let his teachings die, or beat the air, so to speak, with mere words. He determined that his fatal gospel should be perpetuated, and should bring forth as speedy as possible its fruits of death. Even in his lifetime, we have evidence that he constantly conspired with his associates for this end, and that with them he concocted in secret both the means by which his doctrine should reach all classes of Europe, and the methods by which civil order and Christianity might be destroyed. Saint Beuve writes of him and of his in the Journal de Despots, 8th of November 1852, all the correspondence of Voltaire and D'Alembert is ugly. It smells of the sect, of conspiracy, of the brotherhood, of the secret society. From whatever point it is viewed, it does no honor to men who make a principle of lying, and who consider contempt of their kind the first condition necessary to enlighten them. Enlighten and despise the human race. A sure watchword this, and it is theirs. March on, always sneering, my brethren, in the way of truth. That is their perpetual refrain. But not only did he and his thus conspire in a matter which might seem to arise naturally from identical sentiments and aims, but what was infinitely greater consequence, the demon, just as their sad gospel was ripe for propagation, called into existence the most efficacious means possible for the extension among men, and for the wished-for destruction of the Church, of Christian civilization, and of every form of existing Christianity. This was the spread amongst those already demoralized by Voltaireanism, of Freemasonry, and its cognate systems of secret atheistic organization. (4) Freemasonry. Freemasonry, we must remember always, appeared generally and spread generally, too, in the interests of all that Voltaire aimed at, when it best suited his purpose. The first lodge established in France under the English obedience was in 1727. Its founder and first master was the celebrated Jacobite Lord Derwentwater. It had almost immediate acceptance from the degenerate nobility of France, who, partly because of the influence of English and Scotch Jacobite nobles, and partly because of its novelty, hard swearing, and mystery, joined the strange institution. Its lodges were soon in every considerable city of the realm. The philosophers and various school of atheists, however, were the first to enter into and to extend it. For them it had special attractions and special uses, which they were not slow to appreciate and to employ. Now, though it very little concerns us to know much of the origin of this society, which became then and since so notorious throughout the world, still, as that origin throws some light on its subsequent history, it will not be lost time to glance at what is known, or supposed to be known, about it. Monsignor Ségur, Bishop of Grenoble, who devoted much time to a study of Freemasonry, is persuaded that it was first elaborated by Faustus Socinus, the nephew of the too celebrated Laelius Socinus, the heresiarch and founder of the sect of Unitarians, or, as they are generally called after him, Socinians. Both were of the ancient family of Sozzini of Siena. Faustus, like many of his relatives, imbibed the errors of his uncle, and in order to escape the vigilance of the Inquisition, to which both Italy and Spain owed much of their tranquility they enjoyed in these troublesome times, he fled to France. While in that country at Lyons, when only 20 years of age, he heard of the death of his uncle in Zurich, and went at once to that city to obtain the papers and effects of his deceased. From the papers he found that Laelius had assisted at a conference of heretics at Vicenza in 1547, which the destruction of Christianity was resolved upon, and where resolutions were adopted for the renewal of Arianism, a system of false doctrine calculated to sap the very sound foundations of existing faith by attacking the Trinity and the Incarnation. Feller, an authority of considerable weight, in his reference to this conference says, "In the assembly of Vicenza they agreed upon the means of destroying the religion of Jesus Christ, by forming a society which, by its progressive successes brought on, towards the end of the 18th century, an almost general apostasy. When the Republic of Venice became informed of this conspiracy, it seized upon Julian Trevisano and Francis del Rugo, and strangled them. Ochinus and others saved themselves. The society thus dispersed became only more dangerous, and that which it is known today under the name of Freemasons." For this information, Feller refers us to a work entitled De Voli Levi by the Abbé Lafranc, a victim of the Reign of Terror in 1792. The latter tells us that the conspirators whom the severity of the Venetian Republic had scattered, and who were Ocinius, Laelius Socinus, Peruta, Gentilis, Jacques Chiare, François Lenoir, Darius Socinus, and Alicius, and the Abbé Léonard, carried their poison with them, and caused it to bear fruits of death in all parts of Europe. The success of Faustus Socinus in spreading his uncle's theories was enormous. His aim was not only to destroy the Church, but to raise up another temple into which any enemy of orthodoxy might freely enter. In this temple every heterodox belief might be held. It was called Christian, but was without Christian faith, hope, or love. It was simply an astutely planned system for propagating the ideas of its founders. For a fundamental part of the policy of Socinus, and one in which he well instructed his disciples, was to associate either to Unitarianism or to the confederation formed at Vicenza the rich, the learned, the powerful, and the influential of the world. He feigned an equal esteem for Trinitarians and anti-Trinitarians, for Lutherans and Calvinists. He praised the undertakings of all against the Church of Rome, and working upon their intense hatred for Catholicism, caused them to forget their many isms in order to unite them for the destruction of the common enemy. Then what should be effected? It would be time to consider a system agreeable to all. Until then, unity of action inspired by hatred of the Church should reign amongst them. He therefore wished that all his adherents should, whether Lutheran or Calvinist, treat one another as brothers, and hence his disciples have been called at various times United Brethren, Polish Brothers, Moravian brothers, brother Masons, and finally Freemasons. Monsignor Ségur informs us, on the authorities before quoted, as well as upon that of Bergier, that the learned author of a work entitled Les Francs-Maçons Écrasés, the Abbé Leroudin, printed in Amsterdam as early as the year 1747, that the real secret of Freemasonry consisted, even then, in disbelief of the divinity of Christ, and a determination to replace that doctrine, which is the very foundation of Christianity, by naturalism or rationalism. Socinus, having established his sect in Poland, sent emissaries to preach his doctrine stealthily in Germany, Holland, and England. In Germany, Protestants and Catholics united to unmask them. In Holland they blended with the Anabaptists, and in England they found partisans among the Independents and various other sects into which the people were divided. The Abbé Lefranc believes that Oliver Cromwell was a Socinian, and that he introduced Freemasonry into England. Certainly Cromwell's sympathies were not for the Church, favored by the monarchy supplanted, and were much with the Independents. If he was a Socinian, we can easily understand how the secret society of Vicenza could have attractions for one of his anti-Catholic and ambitious sentiments. He gave its members in England, as Monsignor Ségur tells us, the title of Freemasons, and invented the allegory of the Temple of Solomon, now so much used by Freemasonry of every kind, and which meant the original state of man, supposed to be the commonwealth of equality, with a vague deism as its religion. This temple, destroyed by Christ for the Christian order, was to be restored by Freemasonry after Christ and the Christian order should be obliterated by conspiracy and revolution. The state of nature was Hiram, whose murder Masonry was to avenge, and which, having previously removed Christ, was to resuscitate Hiram and rebuilding the temple of nature as it had been before. Monsignor Ségur, moreover, connects modern Freemasonry with the Jews and Templars, as well as with Socinus. There are reasons which lead me to think that he is right in doing so. The Jews for many centuries previous to the Reformation had formed secret societies for their own protection and for the destruction of Christianity which persecuted them, and which they so much hated. The rebuilding of the Temple of Solomon was the dream of their lives. It is unquestionable that they wished to make common cause with other bodies of persecuted religionists. They had special reason to welcome with joy such heretics as were cast off by Catholicism. It is, therefore, not at all improbable that they admitted into their secret conclaves at least some of the discontented Templars, burning for revenge upon those who dispossessed and suppressed the order. The fact would account for the curious combination of Jewish and conventual allusions to be found in modern Masonry. Then, as to its British history, we have seen that numbers of the secret brotherhood of Socinus made their way to England and to Scotland, where they found rich friends and perhaps confederates. I have, therefore, no doubt that the Abbé Lefranc was correct when he says that Cromwell was connected with them. At least, before he succeeded in his designs, he had need of some such secret society, and would, no doubt, be glad to use it for his purposes. But it is not so clear that Cromwell was the first, as Lefranc thinks, to blend that brotherhood with the real Freemasons. The ancient guild of working Masons had existed in Great Britain and in Europe for many centuries. Previous to his time, they were, like every other guild of craftsmen, a body formed for mutual protection and trade offices. But they differed from other tradespeople in this, that from their duties they were more cosmopolitan, and knew more of the ceremonies of religion at a period when the arts of reading and writing were not very generally understood. They travelled over every portion of England and Scotland, and frequently crossed the Channel, to work at the innumerable religious houses, castles, fortifications, great abbeys, churches, and cathedrals, which arose over the face of Christendom in such number and splendor in the Middle and succeeding ages. To keep away interlopers, to sustain a uniform rate of wages, to be known amongst strangers, and, above all, amongst foreigners of their craft, signs were necessary, and these signs could be of value only in proportion to the secrecy with which they were kept within the craft itself. They had signs for those whom they accepted as novices, for the companion mason or journeyman, and for the masters of the craft. In ages when a trade was transmitted from father to son, and formed a kind of family inheritance, we can very well imagine that its secrets were guarded with much jealousy, and that its adepts were enjoined not to communicate them to anyone, not even to their wives, lest they become known to outsiders. The Masons were, if we except the clockmakers and jewelers, the most skilled artisans in Europe. By the cunning of their hands they knew how to make the rough stone speak out the grand conceptions of the architects of the Middle Ages, and often the delicate foliage and flowers and statuary of the fanes they built remind us of the most perfect eras of Greek and Roman sculpture. So closely connected with religion and religious architecture as were these brother Masons, friars, fra, or Freemasons, they shared to a large extent in the favor of popes. They obtained many invaluable charters, but they degenerated. The era of the so-called Reformation was a sad epoch for them. It was an era of church demolition rather than church building. Wherever the blight of Protestantism fell, the beauty and stateliness of church architecture became dwarfed, stunted, and degraded, whenever it was not utterly destroyed. The need of brother Masons had passed, and succeeding Masons began to admit men to their guilds who won a living otherwise than by the craft. In Germany their confraternity had become a cover for the reformers, and Socinus, seeing it as a means for advancing his sect, a method for winning adepts, and progressing stealthily without attracting the notice of Catholic government, would desire, no doubt, to use it for his purposes. We have to this day the statute, the genuine Freemasons of Strasbourg, framed in 1462, and the same revised as late as 1563, but in them there is absolutely nothing of heresy or hostility to the Church. But there is a curious document called the Charter of Cologne, dated 1535, which, if it be genuine, proves to us that there existed at that early period a body of Freemasons, having principles identical with those professed by the Masons of our own day. It is to be found in the archives of the Mother Lodge of Amsterdam, which also preserves the act of its own constitution under the date 1519. It reveals the existence of lodges of kindred intent in London, Edinburgh, Vienna, Amsterdam, Paris, Lyons, Frankfurt, Hamburg, Antwerp, Rotterdam, Madrid, Venice, Gorizia, Königsberg, Brussels, Danzig, Magdeburg, Bremen, and Cologne. And it bears the signatures of well-known enemies of the Church of that period, namely Hermanus, or Herman de Weir, the immoral and heretical Archbishop-Elector of Cologne, placed for his misdeeds under the ban of the Empire; de Coligny, leader of the Huguenots of France; Jacob d'Anville, prior of the Augustinians of Cologne, who incurred the same reproaches as Archbishop Herman; Melanchthon, the Reformer; Nicholas van Noot, Carleton, Bruce, Upson, Banning, Viru, Schroeder, Hoffman, Noble, de la Torre, Doria, Utenbach, Falls, Hussein, and Wermer. These names reveal both the country and the celebrity of all the men who signed the document. It was, possibly, a society like theirs, which the Venetian government broke up and scattered in 1547, for we find the distinct mention of a lodge existing at Venice in 1535. However this may be, Freemason lodges existed in Scotland from the time of the Reformation. One of them is referred to in the Charter of Cologne, and doubtless had many affiliations. In Scotland, as in other Catholic countries, the Templars were suppressed, and there, if nowhere else, that order had the guilds of working masons under its special protection. It is therefore possible, as some say, that the knights coalesced with these masons, and protected their own machinations with the aid of the secrets of the craft. But while this and all else stated regarding the connection of the Templars with Masonry may be true, there is no real evidence that it is so. Much is said about the building of the Temple of Solomon, and that Hiram was killed, and whose death the craft is to avenge, means James Molay, the Grand Master, executed in the barbarous manner of his age for suppressed complicity in the crimes with which the Templars were everywhere charged. There is tall talk about such things in modern Masonry, and a great deal of the absurd and puerile ritual in which the sect indulges when conferring the higher grades is supposed to have reference to them. But the Freemasonry which we have to deal, however connected in its origin with the Templars, with Socinus, with the conspirators of Cologne, or those of Vicenza, or with Cromwell, received its modern characteristics from Elias Ashmole, the antiquary, and the provider, if not the founder, of the Oxford Museum. Ashmole was an alchemist and an astrologer, and imbued consequently with a love for the jargon and mysticism of that strange body so busied about the Philosopher's Stone and other utopias. The existing lodges of the Freemasons had an inexpressible charm for Ashmole, and in 1646 he, together with Colonel Mainwaring, became members of the craft. He perfected it, added various mystic symbols to those already in use, and gave it partly a scriptural, partly an Egyptian form to its jargon and ceremonies. The Rosicrucian degree, a society formed after the idea of Bacon's New Atlantis, appeared, and the various grades of companion, master, secret master, perfect master, elect, and Irish master were either remodeled or newly formed, as we know them now. Charles I was decapitated in 1649, and Ashmole, being a royalist to the core, soon turned English Masonry from the purposes of Cromwell and his party, and made the craft, which was always strong in Scotland, a means to upset the government of the Protector and to bring back the Stuarts. Now Hiram became the murdered Charles, who was to be avenged instead of James Mole, and the reconstruction of the temple meant the restoration of the exiled House of Stuart. On the accession of Charles II, the craft was, of course, not treated with disfavor, and when the misfortunes of James II drove him from the throne, the partisans of the House of Stuart had renewed recourse to it as a means of secret organization against the enemy. To bring back the Pretender, the Jacobites formed a Scotch and an English and an Irish constitution. The English constitution embraced the Mother Lodge of York and that of London, which later separated from York, and with a new spring of action started into life as the Grand Lodge of London in 1717. The Jacobite nobles brought it to France chiefly to aid in their attempts in favor of the Stuarts. They opened a lodge called the Amity and Fraternity in Dunkirk in 1721, and in 1725 the Lord Derwentwater opened the famous Mother Lodge of Paris. Masonry soon spread to Holland in 1730, to Germany in 1736, to Ireland in 1729, and afterwards to Italy, Spain, and Europe generally. All its lodges were placed under the Grand Lodge of England and remained so for many years. I mention these facts and dates in order to let you see that precisely at the period when Freemasonry was thus extending abroad, the infidelity, which had been introduced by Bayle and openly advocated by Voltaire, was being disseminated largely among the corrupt nobility of France and of Europe generally. It was, as we have already seen, a period of universal license in morals, with the great in every country, and the members of the Grand Lodge in England were generally men of easy virtue, whose example was agreeable to continental libertines. Voltaire found that Masonry, to which he had been affiliated in London, was a capital means of diffusing his doctrines among the courtiers, the men of letters, and the public of France. It was like himself, the incarnation of hypocrisy and lying. It came recommended by an appearance of philanthropy and of religion. Ashmole gave it the open Bible, together with the square and compass. It called the world to witness that it believed in God, the great architect of the universe. It had an open eye, which may be taken for God's all-seeing providence, or for the impossibility of a sworn Mason escaping his fate if he revealed the secrets of the crafts, or failed to obey the orders he was selected to carry out. It made members known to each other, just as did the ancient craft in every country, and professed to take charge of the orphans and widows of deceased brethren who could not provide for them. But in its secret conclaves, and in its ascending degrees, it had means to tell the victim whom it could count upon that the architect meant a circle, a nothing, that the open Bible was the universe, and that the square and the compass was simply the fitness of things, the means to make all men fraternal, equal, and free, in some impossible utopia it promised but never gave. In the recesses of its lodges, the political conspirator found men and the means to arrive at his ends in security. Those who ambitioned office found there the means of advancement. The old spirit breathed into the fraternity by Socinus, and nourished so well by the heretical libertines of the England and Germany of the 17th century, and perfected by the infidels of the 18th, was master in all its lodges. Banquets, ribald songs, and jests, reveling in sin, constituted from the beginning a leading feature of its life. Lodges became the secure home for the roue, the spendthrift, the man of broken fortunes, the infidel, and the depraved of the upper classes. Such attractive centers of sin, therefore, spread over Europe with great rapidity. They were encouraged not only by Voltaire, but by his whole host of atheistic writers, philosophers, encyclopedists, revolutionists, and rakes. The scoundrels of Europe found congenial employment in them, and before 20 years elapsed from their first introduction, the lodges were a power in Europe, formidable by the union which subsisted between them all, and by the wealth, social position, and unscrupulousness of those who formed their brotherhood. The principles fashionable, and indeed alone tolerated, in them all, before long, were the principles of Voltaire and of his school. This led in time to the union and illuminism of Freemasonry.